Can everybody hear me okay? Way in the back? Yeah? Okay. If I can't, or if you can't hear me, please let me know. My voice goes up and down. So, before we get too far into this, I just wanted to thanks and appreciation to several groups of people. First, the Western Nebraska Community College for hosting us today. This is so incredibly kind, and I'm very excited to be here. Thank you to News Channel Nebraska, Forrest and Martha, for helping us even get this going and starting the conversation on this. They really were instrumental in getting us all here today. Thank you to the Cheyenne County Historical Society Board, particularly Tom, Dwayne, and Mary for answering all of my questions, giving me access to the Sioux Army Depot collections, and just thank you for trusting me with all of this. And lastly, thank you to all of those who have contributed to this project. Thank you for sharing your stories, your memories, your photographs, everything with me. I truly appreciate your assistance with my project today. And thank you to all of you who showed up. I am so excited to see you and to talk with you today. So as we get started here, some of this information may to you, but I wanted to start us off with something kind of fun. So I'll give you a second to think about this question, but I would love to know what your favorite World War II movie is. And when you know it, you can shout it out.
Pearl Harbor.
Pearl Harbor? I love Pearl Harbor.
Seabees.
Seabees. Oh, I don't think I know what that one is.
Midway.
Midway, that's a great one.
Falls of Montezuma.
Oh, that's a really good one too. Others?
Away all boats.
The whale boats?
Away all boats.
Oh, away all boats. Okay. I don't think I've seen that. I think I know what I'm gonna be doing this summer. Okay, said, has anyone heard of the movie about the Sioux Ordnance Depot? No? Well, that was a trick question. They haven't made one yet, so you're not missing anything. But we are here to talk about history today, right? Why am I asking you about movies? Well, as Dr. Alexander said, I study public history, and we describe public history as the way the public interacts with history. So how many of you have been to a museum before? Raise your hand. Okay, yeah, quite a few. How about a national monument or a memorial of some kind? Yeah? Okay, cool. How about a public talk where history is the subject? Everybody's hand should be up. You're at one of those right now. But these are examples that we use to talk about public history. Well, one of the ways that the public can also interact with history is through movies. And I love to use movies as illustrations for things. So, moving on here, my thesis research has been on the Sioux Ordnance Depot. And through my research, I've uncovered a number of different storylines that Hollywood could use to make a movie about this depot. So today, I'm going to talk to you about 3 of my ideas. The first one is the history of the Sioux Ordnance Depot through an underdog storyline. The second is an action movie idea. And the third one is a romance/drama movie, kind of like Pearl Harbor. So we'll jump in here. I want to set the scene and give you a little bit of background knowledge. So if any of you are familiar with this topic or have been out to the historical marker, you may have seen that it says Sioux Army Depot and not Sioux Ordnance Depot. This has to do with a change in ownership and leadership at a later point in the depot's history that we're not really going to get to today. So I'm going to stick with Ordnance throughout my presentation. The other thing that I wanted to point out is depot versus depot. So I've noticed in the interviews that I've conducted and the people that I've talked to that most remember this place as the depot. This reminds me of the Norfolk versus Norfolk debate. I'm from Norfolk, Nebraska, but if you're not from there, you say Norfolk. So out of respect for the memories here, I'm going to use depot because I am not from here. So we'll keep that as we go throughout here too. Okay, the second part of setting our scene is placing us within the historical timeline. We're going to mostly be focused on the 1940s with a few mentions into the 1950s, and World War II has some pretty memorable dates. So that's where we're going to start here today. On September 1st, 1939, Nazi Germany invaded Poland, and that starts the war in Europe. At this point, America is not involved in the war. That happens a few years later when Japan attacks the naval base at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. The next day, December 8th, 1941, the US declares war and enters World War II. Our story is going to take place somewhere right in between here. Okay, so with all that background information, let's jump into movie idea number 1. We're going to call this The Journey to Vital Defense Territory. There are many stories that the Depot could use, or there are many stories from the Depot that Hollywood could use to make a movie. But I think one of the first ones they should look at is the Depot's underdog story. As early as 1941, there was speculation of a storage ammunition site coming to Sydney. Congressman Harry B. Coffey had written a letter to Mayor Riley E. Roach explaining Sydney's consideration, and news of this came out in the Telegraph News on October 7th. Now, people in town had been seeing others coming around, kind of surveying the land. What they were doing was looking for the best place to put an ammunition storage site. When this news broke, it confirmed those rumors, and it got people talking about the possibility of Sydney receiving this ammunition storage site. Unfortunately, in January 1942, the Army announced that Edgemont, South Dakota would be the recipient of this ammunition storage site. And Edgemont is located right here in the Black Hills region. This depot actually used the igloo storage as well. And I met another historian who was researching this one. It was pretty cool to talk about together. They said at this time that Sydney was rejected initially because it was ill-suited for the storage of lethal gas, which in my opinion is probably okay. We don't need that, you know? At the time, this was sad news for some of the people who were looking for new business to come to the area, right? 1941, this is after the Great Depression. There's an opportunity for more business to help people get out of the Depression. So there were some who were a little upset about this. But there were others who tried to see that Sydney being passed over could really be a good thing. There was an editorial in the local newspaper that compared Sydney to other Nebraska towns that had received some of these ammunition storage sites. The argument of this editorial, which was titled Envy or Pity, was essentially that the consequences of receiving, or the benefits of receiving this depot may not outweigh the consequences. So it was okay for right now that Sydney hadn't received this. My favorite lines in this article are that first, judgment promotes envy because a $25 million bomb loading plant with a payroll of 3,000 persons isn't to be sneezed at. But sober judgment makes us wonder if, in the long run, it will be worth the evacuation of hundreds of substantial farmers from 108 of the richest farms in the county. So it was almost better that the farmers weren't being kicked off their land for these extra people to come in. That's the argument. The author goes on to say, maybe in the long run, the payroll and its accompanying boom will more than pay for the other losses. Maybe, we say, but we doubt it. Despite articles like these, there were some people who remained optimistic that Sydney could receive a site. And it turns out that there was reason to hold on to hope. In early 1942, the Chief of Ordnance called for the construction of 2 more ordnance depots. In March 1942, the War Department announced that they were looking specifically in western Nebraska for this ammunition storage facility. And Congressman Coffey again said that at the time, Sydney was the only city in western Nebraska up for consideration. So the chances of it coming here were really, really good. At this point, they said that Sydney was going to be reconsidered because it was well suited for the government's needs and it was well isolated. In March 1942, they received official authorization for the construction of a depot. The second one was to be built in Toole, Utah. And by May 1942, construction had begun on this facility. Now, when all was said and done, the depot ended up occupying an area of almost 20,000 acres. Here's Sydney on this map here, and all of the blue is the property that the depot owned. It's about 12 miles west and north of town here. With our construction underway, Sioux became part of what the Telegraph, the local newspaper, called a vital defense territory. It said that Sioux was one of 3 major war projects in western Nebraska. The other 2 were in Scottsbluff and Alliance. And I really like this phrase, and I'll use it for all of my movie titles you'll see here. But it shows not only the contributions of Sidney or western Nebraska, it really shows the contributions of the entire state of Nebraska. So you have to bear with me, this is not an exact map. And I plotted out some points of where World War II military installations were. These aren't all of them, but there's some of the main sites that Nebraska had, and you can see there are quite a few. You may recognize some as well. The North Platte Canteen would have been right about here. The Hastings Naval Ammunition Depot was located over here. The Martin Bomber Plant over near Omaha, where they made the plane that dropped the atomic bombs. And then up north here is Fort Robinson, which had POWs at the time. So you can see that Sioux is not the only military installation in the state, but it does have its own unique story to contribute to this history and all of these other places. Okay, back to our depot here. Work progressed very, very quickly at the depot, and by mid-October, Major Preble said that there would be no public announcement of an official opening at the depot. He actually said, quote, "There could be no possible good come from a policy of announcing when and where we begin storing ammunition at the depot," which I can understand. You don't exactly want to let everybody know, hi, we have bombs over here now. However, our government records do show us when they started to receive ammunition, and that was towards the end of 1942 in December. This starts a 25-year-long operation of the depot then. So you may be wondering, why is this considered an underdog story? If you think about the qualities of an underdog story, there's typically a character who has very little chance of competing or overcoming an obstacle, and then they do that. If you've seen movies like Miracle or Rocky, even The Karate Kid, those are some of our underdog movies. I think that this is considered an underdog story because Sidney, a town of about 9,000 people in 1940, was given the chance to compete with all of these other installations. They had to compete with other communities in the nation to receive a depot, and they also had to compete with other military installations in the state. So the fact that they were given this opportunity makes them that underdog story. Throughout its history, Sioux is going to receive many awards and accolades. For example, one of the first that the employees receive is in late 1942, early 1943. Because construction had been completed ahead of schedule, everybody who was a part of that received a medallion that looked like this. It's about the size of a challenge coin. So it's not like this big glamorous medal, it's pretty small. But each of them are inscribed with the person. So they said, presented to the person, this is Paul Albin, one who made possible completion of the combat equipment storage area at Sioux Ordnance Depot ahead of schedule, with sincere appreciation of the commanding officers there. On a side note, this medal is actually how I became introduced to this whole project. There was a woman in Kearney who found this medal specifically. It was in her father's belongings, and she wanted to know more about this because from her recollection, her father was not involved in World War II. He worked construction and was in Alaska for a time, but he never served. So she was really confused as to what a Sioux Ordnance Depot was and where that was in Alaska. She went down to the local Armed Forces Recruiting Center in Kearney, trying to find the Army, because she thought maybe they could tell her about who these guys were and what this place was. She knocked on the door, rang the doorbell. The Army wasn't home, but there was a Marine there. And this Marine happens to be my fiance. And he answered the door, she told him her whole story, and he said, "Ma'am, I have no idea what you're talking about." But he goes, "You know what, my girlfriend is a historian and I bet she can help you." And so I got connected with Miss Alta, and here we are. So anyway, these medals, these awards and accolades are a result of the War Department's decision to locate this depot in Sydney, giving them that chance to compete. These are some of the other awards that the depot receives throughout its time. I won't read all of them, but you can see that there's quite a few. The fact that they're able to get that recognition is pretty amazing. So that is why I think this is an underdog story. Overall, the War Department's decision to create the depot in Sydney gave Western Nebraskans, Sydney, and all of those who moved to the depot a chance to compete and be a part of this World War II history. Okay, movie number 2. We're gonna look at action now. Because I know we're talking about World War II. Everyone loves that really good underdog story. But if I'm being honest, I need a little bit of action in World War II movies. Anybody else? Yeah? So we're gonna call this movie Adventures in a Vital Defense Territory. There are lots of tales of danger and adventure to be found at the depot. And I think Hollywood could use, again, any one of these to make a really good action movie. So first of all, the very existence of the depot implies danger and action. This is the mission of the depot when it first opened its doors, and that was the receipt, storage, and issue of Army ammunition, ammunition components, and general supplies. Throughout its history, the depot is going to participate in some re-warehousing procedures and some demilitarization processes, but this kind of remains the primary one throughout that time. Excuse me. What this means then is that the employees are constantly going to be working with weapons and ammunition, giving them that danger element. Sioux Ordnance Depot handled all sorts of ammunition and general supplies. I mean, they had everything from howitzer shells to small arms ammunition. I've got some examples of this type of ammunition up here. In this image, she has 105 millimeter howitzer shells. This middle one is a 100-pound bomb, and then the one on the far end over here is a 200-pound bomb. So these are the small arms, but they also housed large ammunition. I found 1,000 and 4,000-pound bombs. This is an image of some of those out there. They also had general supplies, as it's stated in the mission. This is stuff like automobiles, spare tank parts, office machines and supplies, the fluids you may need for some of these things, like brake fluids, and really anything you would need to run a base somewhere else, they stored on the depot property. Now, the employees knew that they had to be careful when you're handling things like this, obviously. And the depot won several awards for its safety, but accidents still happen, and we're going to talk about one of those here. So the depot construction included 802 storage igloos, and you can see here on this top image is one of those igloos being built, and this is a relatively recent image of an igloo today. Many of the oral history interviews that I conducted and records I come across, as well as local memories, have said that there are 801 igloos. And I was trying to figure out what happened to that other one. Why is it 802 and not 801? It's part of a historian's job to analyze different historical accounts and try to cross-reference or verify the information that we come across. And what I have found is that the reason there's a discrepancy between the 801 that are remembered and the 802 that were initially constructed was the result of an explosion. So in December 1947, one of the igloos out at the depot exploded. The report afterwards showed that it was a complete accident. The workers were moving ammunition for a shipment out from igloo J601. At the time an M3 spotting charge detonated, what they found was that a safety pin in the charge had been moved out of the place. It was nobody's fault, it just happened. But what it meant was that if the box was jostled or moved at any point, it would detonate, which it did. The ignition of that charge set off a series of explosions in the igloo. It destroyed the igloo and claimed one life, taking away one of those igloos. So there are in fact 801 left, but there were 802 to start. There was another major incident in October of 1954 when a fire engulfed the normal maintenance building. The investigation from this one showed that what had happened was there was failure to cut both friction ignition wires of an M26 flare. This is an image from the National Archives case file on this explosion. And you can see it indicates where one side has been cut, but not the other. The result of this flare being ignited then in the demilitarization process was destruction of the building. It cost about $34,000 worth of damage, but thankfully no one was injured in this fire. These images, again from that case file, show you just the amount of destruction that was there. I believe the photographer is standing like right here looking this way, and then they're standing on the other side, photographing both sides of that demilitarization process. Okay, an action movie could definitely incorporate some of these dangerous events, but I think it could also incorporate some stories of adventure, especially if we take a look at the employees of the depot. Now, a continual problem throughout the depot's history is going to be finding people to work there. There are definitely some perks to building a military installation in an isolated area out in the middle of nowhere, but finding a large employment pool is not one of them. The depot personnel got creative though, and they found many solutions to this problem. Therefore, the employees of the depot included all of these groups of people. Women were employed in more non-traditional roles. Soldiers from Fort Warren in Wyoming were brought out, and I found that most of these soldiers were African American. The sugar beet workers and other farmers were employed in their off seasons. High school students were employed in the summer months. Japanese Americans who had been incarcerated in confinement sites were also used as employees. People with physical disabilities were employed, and even prisoners of war were used at the depot. For an action or an adventure movie, I think that the POWs might have a really interesting story for Hollywood here. So here's our map again. One of the most often discussed stories about the depot are the POWs who were kept there during World War II. How many of you knew that before coming here? Yeah, case in point. In spring of 1943, Scotts Bluff built a POW camp. They were one of two major base POW camps in the western part of the state. The other one was at Fort Robinson up north. After Scotts Bluff started to receive POWs, they sent about 300 Italian POWs down to Sioux to work there. The Italians filled a variety of roles at the depot. However, the Geneva Convention of 1929 forbade their use in any direct dealings with ammunition. So the commanding officers of the depot had to get a little more creative, but they placed the POWs in jobs that were best suited for their skills and that also abided by the Geneva Convention. For example, POWs who were skilled in electricity often ended up working with other electricians. I found some accounts that said if they could speak English, they were also employed in the office settings. POWs were also used for farm labor in the areas where they were kept. Agriculture is also going to be hit very, very much so by World War II, and so labor is needed to help farm. Farmers could request help from the depot. They could drive up, pick up POWs in the morning, take them back to their farms, have them work, and then bring them back in the afternoon. So even though this slide only shows Italian POWs, they weren't the only ones used at the depot. In 1943, towards the end of the year, Italy surrendered, and so things started to change. Scotts Bluff was no longer housing as many Italian POWs, they started to house German POWs. As a result, about 300 of the German POWs were sent to the depot to work there as well. In my studies, I found that there is a clear distinction between the treatment of these two groups, meaning the Italians were perceived a little more positively, they had a little more freedom. Well, that's because they were no longer at war at the time. The Germans are perceived with a little more negative attitude, but not all memories of the German POWs are negative. For the most part, I found that the POWs who were at the depot assisted with whatever labor needs there were. Mr. Joe Beam, who started working at the depot in 1945, I believe he was 16 or 17 years old, he worked with the POWs. And so it was his job to drive them wherever they needed to be for work that day. He would also supervise them at those various job sites. But when we got to talking about the POWs, this is what he had to say about the German POWs. He said, I worked with them, the German POWs, when they were on the railroad. They were good workers because they wanted to go back. We never had no problem with them really or anything, you know? They liked it here. And Joe's a little unique because his family heritage is German. His family immigrated from Germany to Russia to the United States. So he was a first generation American, and he could speak German. So I think that's why he had a little bit different interaction with them. Even if there were some grumpy POWs, all of their work really helped the depot, and it helped them be successful. So by combining the danger of explosives with the adventure that any one of these POWs endured to get to the center of the nation, I think we have a lot of really great material for an action movie about the depot. All right, movie idea number 3. We're gonna call this one Love and Drama in a Vital Defense Territory. If Hollywood were looking for material for a romance movie, or even just a drama movie, I think the depot's a great source. And love pairs really nicely with drama movies. Like I said, Pearl Harbor, one of my favorites. But we could create our own kind of out of this too. What I found very interesting is that there really is no shortage of romance at this depot, and that was not something I was expecting. Right? We're gonna jump back to our Italian POWs. How many of you know of Campanella or have heard him before? Several? So his whole story is about love. This was one of the first POW stories I encountered, and I just think it's really, really sweet. So Campanella served in the Italian army during World War II. He was captured in Tunisia by the British and then found his way to Scottsbluff, Nebraska, of all places. He worked as a janitor at Scottsbluff for about 6 months, and then they transferred him to Sioux Ordnance Depot. When he got here, they assigned him to railroad work, which was something he wasn't really good at, and he got pneumonia. When he had recovered from this, the doctor reassigned him and gave him a job doing something he was better at, which was electrical work. So he got to handle all the electrical needs or any problems that they had at the depot. He also worked on forklifts, and this was how he met his future wife. Edith Rocker was a woman who drove a forklift, and Campanella had seen her a few times. He met her. He kind of learned what building she was going to be in, and would happen to be there too, so he could meet with her. They had lunch several times, and their romance blossomed. Campanella was in Sydney for about 2 years, and then in 1945, they said they were sending him back to Italy. So he told Edith, if you come back to Italy, to Genoa, where I'm from, we'll get married. So she did, and they did. And then when she was expecting her first child, Campanella decided to send her back to the United States so the child would be born here. And then he followed a few months later. The day after he landed in the United States, his daughter was born. They ended up settling in Sterling, Colorado. They had 4 children together, and they lived their life until Edith passed away in the 1960s due to kidney problems. But Campanella is not the only one to find romance out at this depot. I've encountered lots of people who met their spouses while there. Joe Beam, actually, who I mentioned earlier, he met his wife at the depot. She was working at the grocery store on that area, and he met her there. Vince Schmidt is another person that I have met who met his wife at the depot. He was in the Navy for a time and then worked at the depot from 1951 to 1954, and he was employed in several different roles. He started off as a munitions handler, then became a semi-truck driver, and worked as a lift operator in general supply. But his sister also worked at the depot. She worked in the headquarters building, and she was friends with his wife, and that's how he got to know his wife. So, the love stories of the employees could also be included in this drama movie that we're talking about, that also features other depot employees' experiences, such as those from the Japanese American confinement sites. During World War II, 120,000 Japanese Americans who were living on the West Coast were removed from their homes and put into more interior locations. At the time, these places were called relocation centers. Survivors have called them concentration camps. Others have referred to them as internment camps. The National Park Service actually recommends that we use terms like confinement site or incarceration camp to accurately describe these places. There were 10 confinement sites that were created by the War Relocation Authority. On this map, they are the stars. So there was Tule Lake and Manzanar in California, Poston and Gila River in Arizona, Topaz in Utah, Minidoka in Idaho, Heart Mountain in Wyoming, Amache or Granada in Colorado, and Roar and Jerome in Arkansas. This map also shows several other Department of Justice detainment sites. But looking at this map, you'll notice that there's nothing in Nebraska. So the big question is, how did Japanese Americans from those confinement sites end up in Nebraska? The short answer is that they were permitted to work outside of the confinement sites. It's also important to note that in these discussions, most of the people who were incarcerated were American citizens, and you may hear the term Nisei used in these discussions. That means second generation. So in 1944, towards the end of the year, Sioux was in dire need of employees. They were behind in their mission quotas, and the population of Cheyenne County had been tapped out. The depot commanders tried everything they could to fill those empty jobs, but they were struggling. So they wrote a letter to Washington, D.C. appealing for help. They received a response back that said, recruit from the Japanese American confinement sites. So the commanding officers decided to pursue this. They advertised in the confinement site newspapers, and they recruited from as many of those as possible. Most of the ones that came to work at the depot came from Minidoka in Idaho and Amache in Colorado. This is a picture of Annie Takamatsu. She was in her early 20s when her family was incarcerated. They were living in California at the time and ended up in Amache, Colorado. She applied for work outside of the depot, was granted clearance in April of 1945, and started working at the depot in May. I've actually been in contact with Annie's daughter, Sharon, and Annie kept a diary of her times while she was there. And so she'll note the jobs that she had, which was an ammunition handler, the money she was paid, and just some of her experiences being at the depot. So it's really neat to have that first-person perspective. Larry Mallman, in his summary of the depot's history, said that, quote, they, meaning the Nisei, became an indispensable part of the community and proved to be highly valued employees. This is an image that hangs on the museum's wall of 3 Japanese Americans. You can see they're stacking ammunition inside of an igloo. So their work was just as valuable, and they were very valued. Not all of the Japanese Americans who worked at the depot came from the confinement sites. What's really interesting is that western Nebraska actually has a long history of Japanese settlement. You may have heard of some famous Nebraskans like Father Hiram Kano or Ben Kuroki. Those are just a few from that population in western Nebraska. On a side note, shameless plug, the Japanese Hall at the Legacy of the Plains Museum in Gering is having its grand opening on June 8th, and that museum is addressing some of this history. So if you're available to go, I highly encourage you to. I've gotten to work with the director, and she's helped me a lot, so it's a very cool place. You should go. On that note, we do know that some of the Japanese Americans there came from the confinement sites, and one of the ways we can tell that is through the WRA photos, or the War Relocation Authority photos. So these are a few other ones. You can see that they're stacking ammunition again in an igloo, and I believe they're in a boxcar, railroad car in this one. Okay. A drama movie that features the employees of the Sioux Ordnance Depot could also highlight the experiences of some of those with physical disabilities. Most World War II home front accounts don't usually mention people with physical disabilities. In recent years, like about the last 20, research has shown that people with disabilities were highly sought after during World War II. For example, the Milwaukee Ordnance plant was intentionally seeking women who were deaf. They said that they could work in exceptionally loud places, and they already knew sign language for communication. So to them, these women possessed a very valuable skill, and they wanted them to work for them. A lot of disability history mentions the employment of veterans after World War II, but Sioux, like Milwaukee, was hiring people with physical disabilities before then. This idea was very new to me, and I came across this for the first time in a historical summary from the 1960s. It was this photograph of a man, and below it was a caption. You'll have to bear with me, it does have some dated language here. The photo is Hubert John, and it says, quote, Hubert John's record at Sioux doesn't show any effects of the rheumatoid arthritis from which he suffers. Mr. John, a painter at the depot, is typical of the many handicapped workers employed at the depot. Earlier, we saw that the depot had won several awards for its hiring of people with physical disabilities. These three photographs came from a newspaper article in the Sioux Arrow, which was the depot's newspaper. And this was during one of those award ceremonies that they had. But these three men were hired during World War II as part of this mission of needing more people. This is a story that I'm still researching and learning more about, so if you have any information, I am all ears. Okay, those are all of my movie ideas, and if that's not enough material for Hollywood, I'm really not sure what else they're looking for. Send them my way. I've got some others I didn't mention here too. We really only covered about the first 5 years of the depot's history. There's about 15 to 20 more to do, so if you've got like another hour, I'm kidding, I won't do that today. But I really think that looking at the experiences of the people at the depot is the most interesting part of this research. The depot officially closes in 1967. June 30th is the final day. And throughout its time, they scale back on workers and they hire more people and they scale back. But this is at the point at which it's finally done and over. The area itself still exists. This is a screen grab from Google. It's mostly private property now, so I wouldn't encourage you to go drive and explore yourself. For a time, the Western Nebraska Technical College owned some of the property, and from my understanding, the Adams Trucking Company owns most of it today. So it is private property. With that being said, I'm still looking for stories to tell. I'm still eager to hear memories and learn new things. My current research aspects are the people with physical disabilities. I'm also very interested in learning about the soldiers who were employed out here from Wyoming. And then I've learned that there were some Mexican workers who are also involved with the construction of the depot. So if you have any memories to share or you know somebody, even if you just have memories from living in the community, I would love to talk with you. I did bring these little sheets of paper that have information about my research. And then if you're handy with it, there's a QR code on the back or the link to a survey for an interview. Otherwise, just call or email me and I'll get in touch with you. All right. Overall, the Sioux Ordnance Depot has some very unique stories to contribute to Nebraska's military history. And I'm still exploring many of those, but I hope that one day we'll get to see a movie that's made about this place. So, thank you very much.